Hello, everybody. We are expecting a large swath of severe weather going from central Texas all the way up to western Illinois. We are expecting all hazards today, but it's mostly going to be a wind and hail risk with a small tornado threat. The date is June 3rd, 2025, and let's dive right into the forecast. Starting on the Storm Prediction Center page, the SPC has highlighted a big slight risk starting in central Texas and going all the way up to western Illinois. This is expected to be a mostly wind and hail threat with a 15% risk of wind in that area and a smaller 15% risk of hail only spanning from central Texas to the northern Oklahoma and Kansas border. Along with this is a small 2% tornado risk, which spans the entire risk area, going from central Texas all the way up to southern Wisconsin. For our day 2 outlook, we have 2 isolated marginal risk, one in western Texas, eastern New Mexico, and southern Colorado, and another one spanning from southern Illinois all the way up to Lake Erie and Lake Huron. This is expected to be an almost entirely wind and hail threat with a 5% wind risk in both of our marginal areas, along with a 5% hail risk. For our day 3 outlook, the Storm Prediction Center is expecting a little bit more of a larger return of severe weather to the central plains, with a slight risk centered over the Texas Panhandle and central to northern Oklahoma. And looking further out, the Storm Prediction Center has gone and issued a day 4 airplane-shaped risk going from the Oklahoma Panhandle all the way to central Tennessee and Kentucky. To get even crazier, they added a day 5 15% severe weather risk going from eastern Oklahoma all the way to Mississippi and Alabama. For our lower plains sector of where we're expecting severe weather today, we can see yesterday's convection out here. This could actually hamper today's environment by using up the ingredients out here today and sort of not letting the ingredients build. We can also see sort of a elongated low out here. That's going to help initiate storms today. As we push forward into the early afternoon, we can sort of see our storms up here just north of the Kansas-Oklahoma border kind of getting their act together. And then another thing we'll see is that we get scattered storms in central Oklahoma around the very early afternoon, and then it turns into a line. But we do notice that we do have some prefrontal convection out here in front of what's going to be our main line. Now, what happens as these interact is that they could temporarily increase the spin with each other, which makes central Oklahoma one of today's areas with a larger probability of a tornado. Now, as we go into the later afternoon and evening, we see some discrete convection out here in northern Texas, just west of the DFW Metroplex, which is right here. Now, this is when that tornado and hail threat is going to be maximized out here. But like all of our other storms today, this is expected to turn into a line, creating powerful winds. But that's not all. As we go into the night hours, we actually see towards the tail end of our line, we get more storms trailing towards the Austin and San Antonio area, bringing that wind and hail threat with a non-zero probability for a tornado as well. Moving on to our Midwest sector of severe weather today, we can also see yesterday's convection out here sort of hampering that environment in front of these storms. And as we go towards storm time today, we see a lot of scattering convection here with the first look of sort of organized storms happening in eastern Kansas. Now, as we move into the early afternoon, we can sort of see some prefrontal convection along as our line really getting its act together with an area of increased vorticity where our two boundaries sort of meet, and then where this prefrontal stuff out here kind of meets our line, temporarily increasing vorticity like I discussed for our lower plains region. And then as we move into the later afternoon and evening, we can really see our line sort of mature. And this is when that wind threat is going to be maximized across this region. One last thing before we start looking at our convective based models, here is our 500 millibar upper air. Looking at one of the factors causing our storms today, we can see a large scale trough across the upper region of the United States today, causing our weather up here. And then we can also notice a short wave out here, which is going to be the cause for weather in mainly this region down here. One thing I'm going to preface before we go into our convective models is that we do see a lot of cloud cover out here today. Now, this is going to be because these areas have the most clearing slash broken clouds, which is going to allow these areas to destabilize the most. Another thing to look for, which could develop later into the day, are surprise outflow boundaries from these storms, which, if any storms today can kind of attach to those outflow boundaries, that would be an area with an increased probability for tornado genesis. Starting with the Cape in our southern plains sector, we can see today that we get a fairly nice swath of Cape that builds in front of our storms around the early afternoon. We can see that we have pockets of 3,000 Cape, but mostly 2,000 to 2,500 Cape in front of these storms. So our air mass is definitely going to be juiced up today. Now, our wind vectors are actually going to be somewhat parallel to our initiating boundary up here, which is going to be a cause for that linear mode. Our expected temperatures today are going to be in the low to upper 80s, definitely giving that instability and buoyancy in the atmosphere. But with our early morning convection, this is something that is an uncertainty about how hot will it actually get in front of these storms. Another thing we noticed is a differential heating boundary out here in Texas. This could be another cause for a lift creating storms later. And then we can see our fairly strong cold front up here with a gradient going from 53 to 87 pretty quickly. That's going to be another cause for that increased forcing and linear mode today. Looking at our Cape in our Midwest sector, we can actually see that it peaks around 3,000 with areas ranging from 2,000 to 2,500 for the most part today around the early afternoon, with a little increased bubble in western to central Missouri. So that is going to be an area to look out for in particular later. Like we could see from our lower plain sector is that our wind vectors are pretty parallel to our initiating boundary. So up here convection is going to be mostly linear, in the exception to some prefrontal convection that we are expecting later. For our temperatures, again, we can see that it does get pretty toasty in front of these, with areas of mostly low 80s in front of our storms, increasing that lift and instability in the atmosphere. But like I said before, there are questions about how hot it will actually be out here because of our morning convection. Now, looking at our dew point temps, we can see that moisture is going to be abundant for our storms today, with areas reaching low 70s and low 60s. So that is definitely going to be enough for storms to sort of organize and last. Moving back to our lower plains sector, we can see that the abundance of moisture we saw in the Midwest is even more plentiful down here, giving way to potentially stronger storms. Here's our 0 to 3 kilometer relative helicity for our lower plains sector. This gives us a pretty good insight on updrafts and sustaining updrafts today. We can see that there's definitely enough helicity for updrafts to sustain, with kind of it maximizing out in central Missouri and Oklahoma. And then as we move into the later hours, our environment in Texas starts to really get primed with these areas of up to 300 0 to 3 kilometer relative helicity, allowing the storms out here to be fairly organized and create that larger wind and hail threat, along with a threat for some tornadoes. Here is our 0 to 1 kilometer SRH, which is most associated with tornado genesis. And what we can see out here is that we notice it peaks around the evening hours when our low level jet really starts to ramp up, and then in front of our storms in Texas later in the day. For our Midwest sector, it's sort of the same story, with enough 0 to 3 kilometer SRH for updrafts to sustain and have these storms live longer, with it sort of peaking out here in across Missouri, and even a good bit all the way up into Wisconsin. And then for our 0 to 1 kilometer SRH, which is again most associated with tornado genesis, we can see that we do get a decent swath up here in central Missouri around the evening when our low level jet really starts to ramp up. And again, we see a decent swath all the way up here into eastern Wisconsin. And that is one of the reasons why our tornado threat extends further north today. Taking a quick look at some of our soundings, this is a sounding from our central Missouri area. We can see that we have a weird, funky little hodograph with not super strong winds in the upper levels, which could be a reason why storms won't be as organized or last as long today. But we do see some low level shear, and then we do see some relative helicity, making that tornado threat non zero today. We see 6.8 Celsius decreasing per kilometer lapse rates, which is not great, but also definitely not bad. We see a solid temperature and dew point gradient. We see lowest free convection and lowest cloud levels, making again helping making that tornado threat non-zero. And we do see some saturated air with dry air loft helping with lift today. That's definitely going to help because we have enough forcing to not make that an issue. Solid cape, 3,500 surface cape, and 151.3 cape, helping making these storms stronger today and making that tornado threat non-zero as well. And then our precipitable water is 1.74 inches, which is going to help make those downdrafts stronger, along with which is going to help kind of bolster that wind threat. Moving on to our photograph from central Oklahoma. Once again, we see that we have a weird, funky little photograph with some curving in the lower levels, but our deep level shear is quite weak. That's mirrored down here. This is going to mean that these storms could be less organized and last not as long. And we do see some lower level shear, and then we also see over 100 surface helicity out here, may help making that tornado threat non-zero today. Moving on to our SKU-T chart, we see very good dew point temperature difference. We do see 6.6 Celsius decreasing per kilometer lapse rates. Not bad, but not great. Again, we do see a very saturated atmosphere with our first hint of drier air aloft starting at 6 kilometers up. That's fairly high. That is going to sort of decrease the lift out here. We do see low LCLs, which help make that tornado risk non-zero. We see almost 4,000 surface cape and 131.3 cape. So that's going to mean that these storms have a lot of surface instability, making them stronger and help making that tornado threat non-zero. But we do see a very high amount of precipitable water, enhancing that downdrafts and possibly making these storms outflow dominant fairly quickly, which would increase the wind risk and decrease the tornado risk in these storms. Last but not least, for what I think is our most potent sounding today, here is our northern Texas sounding. Immediately, we see definitely more curve in our photograph, and then we see it kind of straighten out here with ample deep level shear to kind of keep these storms organized. We see a solid amount of low level shear, and then we see a solid amount of relative helicity, not as much near the surface, but higher up for our 0 to 3 kilometer, we see plenty to keep these storms organized. Our surface instability is actually expected to be lower down here by time storms fire in the later hours, with around 2,500 cape and 55 surface cape. And then we do see a fairly high precipitable water again today, which is going to help increase the strength of those downdrafts and increase the wind threat down here. Our LCLs are a bit higher, which could kind of lower the tornado threat, but our dew point temperature spread is quite solid. There's not going to be a lot of capping in front of these storms. Our lapse rates are pretty good at 7.2 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. We see dry air aloft helping with lift. So all of these are going to kind of help make that tornado threat non-zero. And then this is definitely something indicative of a larger hail and wind threat. Moving on from today into our more long-term forecast, here is our long-term European model precipitation outlook. And as we can see, these are our storms today and the rest of the week from this system. And then for our sort of later in the week, 15% from day 4, day 3, 4, and 5, we can kind of see that system out here, bringing rain from western Oklahoma all the way to the Dixie Alley. And then also we see some tropical nature out here associated with something the National Hurricane Center has highlighted. So that's going to be something to look at as we move forward into the week. And then as we move on, we see some disturbances here and there, but our next big severe weather system looks to be brought by this guy up here. a northern upper level trough, sort of bringing a boundary across the United States, and even possibly, this is farther out, bringing a rare severe weather risk to the Northeast come Monday. To cap off today's forecast, we're going to look at our climatological factors as usual. We see that we have a slight risk of excessive rainfall out here in our main risk area, with another one back in southeastern California, southern Nevada, and western to central Arizona. And then, not surprisingly, we have another one down here in southern Florida associated with those storms that they're getting every day due to that westerly flow across the state. Here is our 6 to 10 day temperature outlook valid from June 8th to June 12th. We can see that everywhere where there's troughing expected, we can see below average to near normal temperatures, and then around it, trends are expecting a stronger ridge to develop back here out west, bringing hotter temperatures, and then above average temperatures everywhere else. Now, for our 6 to 10 day precipitation outlook, also valid from the 8th to the 12th, we see above average precip associated with our trough and weather systems out here from the central to eastern United States, with actually normal precipitation expected in the northeast. And then we see below average precip expected in the northwest, which is also going to be associated with that ridging.